America's newest land battleships prove their power on the testing ground. Called General Lee's, in honor of the South's famous Civil War leader, they're rated by ordnance experts as more powerful than anything their size.
The entire US lost, 1,400 tanks of all sorts in Western Europe. For something that blew up if a German looked at it sideways, they lost 1/6 as many tanks as, let's say, the Germans built Panthers.
But you may have noticed in the past couple of years, there's been a change in narrative, and recently a lot more credit has been given to Allied equipment, especially the Sherman.
Capable of plunging through streams up to the driver's hatch, the all-welded monsters roll on like giant living amphibians.
In fact, the Sherman ticks a lot of these boxes here that we've been talking about previously. It was easy to mass produce, it was a fairly capable vehicle, and was able to be used on all fronts, from the steppes of Russia to the jungles of Southeast Asia. It's been really nice to see the Sherman's reputation revamped by historians in recent years after the tarnishing it took from the book that shall not be named.
Shermans were not deaf, they were a very, very good piece of equipment.
Nope. You are there! Not a big surprise.
This means that the Sherman has almost as much frontal armor as the Tiger does.
Enemy spotted. Terrorist win.
If it's not fun, why bother?
Keep crying, baby!
Production and performance figures are a military secret, but there are plenty more where these came from.
Chances are, if you've decided to click on this video, you like tanks, or at least have a minor interest in them. And chances are, if you know anything about tanks, you've heard of the Sherman, or have at least seen it somewhere. It's a pretty recognizable tank, easily one of the most famous American tanks ever made next to, I don't know, the Abrams, and definitely one of the most recognizable tanks of World War II. Well, you see, I really like the Sherman. Kind of always have. Despite what impressions you may have gotten from my last tank video, I'm not a wereaboo, and I try my best not to completely suck any one country's dick for too long. But I mean, $20 is $20, and wereaboos are more than willing to throw out hot dollars to get me to talk pretty about their precious Tiger. But my true allegiance is to the Sherman. Until very recently, I thought I had a pretty good understanding of the history of the Sherman and its variants, and felt very confident telling other people all about them, as if my word was gospel. But I always had a few questions I was never man enough to find the answers to. After all, War Thunder would teach me all I needed to know about the Sherman, right? I mean, they have almost every variant. It's all right here at my fingertips. But I still had my doubts, and I finally decided to do some proper digging around with the Sherman, and discovered something miraculous. I realized I knew nothing about the many variants of the Sherman. My life was completely turned upside down, and I fell into a deep depression for many months. I didn't eat anything. I didn't drink anything. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't even play XCOM 2 to relieve my stresses like I usually do, because they updated the mod launcher and now half of my Star Wars mods don't work anymore. I was at my breaking point, and I didn't even try to cope. I just buried my head in the sand like an ostrich during a thunderstorm and tried to deny my failure. But it was no use. So, eventually, I got my head out of the sand and buried it in knowledge. Just a heads up, I have a job. I get paid money to do things at my job. However, I have a lot of free time at my job.
Knowledge.
I have access to the internet at my computer, and I can access my Google Drive from said computer. So, I did what anyone would do at their job when they have free time, and I sunk hours and hours of it researching the Sherman. I'm not joking here. I literally spent every free second I had doing the research for this video, writing this script, and just building this video in my head. It took me weeks of non-stop, passionate work, and I've loved every second of it. It's moments like this that reinforce in my head that tanks are my true passion. Sitting before you now, recording this voiceover in my pajamas, I feel enlightened, like the Sherman God himself has descended upon me and given me the 10 Commandments. And so I have created this video to pass that knowledge on to you all. Any questions you could ever have regarding the Sherman and its many variants will be answered in this video, and trust me when I say, my intel is solid. Many of you may have clicked on this video mere tank perusers, a casual viewer and enjoyer of tanks. Some of you may already be grizzled veterans, but I can guarantee all of you will leave this video better men. Or women, I don't discriminate. The knowledge I'm about to bestow upon you will be priceless, and you will be granted the honor of passing it on to your friends, who almost certainly don't care and will just pretend to listen. Either way, your lives will be forever changed. Hello everybody, my name is Edit320, and this is a slightly confusing guide to the Sherman Tank. So, without further ado, let's just jump right into this. Now, before we can explain the Shermans, we have to understand them. I used to think I had a solid idea of what the Sherman lineage looked like. After all, it's right here in War Thunder. This was my basis for all my Sherman knowledge on the visual level. If I ever forgot what an M4A2 Sherman looked like, I came straight here. I hope I shouldn't have to say this, but this was not a good way to go about this. In fact, it was very dumb, and I highly suggest no one base your knowledge of tanks on a video game like I did, because you'll almost certainly get it all wrong, like I did. Due to my stupidity, however, my idea of the Sherman lineage looked like this, with the M4 being at the top, like it is in War Thunder, and each variant moved down the line, one after another. The M4 came first, was used for a while, then the M4A1 was designed to take its place. Then, after the M4A1 had its run, the M4A2 was introduced as the next step in the line, and so on. Of course, I knew that multiple Shermans were being produced around the same time, and some were produced at the same time, and I knew that every variant coexisted on the battlefield at one point, but I always saw each variant as an upgrade and a next step in the line of the Sherman lineage, just like it is in War Thunder. This could not be further from the truth, and the discovery I made in this regard is kind of the whole reason I wanted to make this video. The Sherman variants weren't upgrades of each other, or progression in a linear fashion like most tanks, but instead, all variants of the Sherman were produced at the same time. In fact, most of them had production begin in the same few months. This means the Shermans don't exist in a lineage, but a literal family tree. So, that will be the structure for today's lesson. I will be taking the Sherman family tree and breaking it down for you all, giving each variant its role in the family. I'm going to try my best to give them roles that make sense for the history of that variant, but feel free to tell me how you would have done it in the comments below. Before we can jump into each variant though, there are a few ground rules of this family that you all should know. I base these rules on the mistakes and confusions of not only myself, but also ones I saw on forums and discussions. Think of these as the answers to the Sherman's frequently asked questions. If you want to be able to accurately identify a Sherman of any kind, you must follow these simple rules. I will also be using War Thunder for some of my visuals, because despite how I was literally just telling you not to use War Thunder, the models for the tanks in this game are actually very good. Plus, I like having a 3D visual I can walk you through rather than just pointing arrows at still images. Rule number 1. Every Sherman had small hatch and large hatch variants, with the small hatch Shermans having a more dramatically sloped front plate, but the hatches stuck out the front. versus the large hatch Shermans having a front plate that was sloped slightly less, but allowed room for the hatches and kept the front plate as one smooth surface. Since every model of Sherman started out with small hatches but were then later produced with large hatches as an upgrade, it is not a guaranteed way to identify a Sherman. Every variant of the Sherman also had direct vision ports at first, but most factories got rid of them fairly quickly, except for one which produced Shermans with them until 1944. Rule number 2. Shermans had two main turret designs, one for the 75mm gun and one for the 76mm gun. The turret for the 76mm was designated as the T-23, so that's what I'll be referring to it as for the rest of this video. As far as the turrets go, there were slight differences all across the board, and as a general rule of thumb, the turret as a whole shouldn't be used to identify the Sherman model, as turrets got swapped around all the time. Rule number 3. Shermans had two types of transmission cases, 3-piece riveted or 1-piece cast. As time went on, 3-piece riveted was phased out in preference of 1-piece cast, so you can see both on any model of Sherman. Although there are two major exceptions to this rule, it is not a guaranteed way to identify a Sherman. Rule number 4. 75mm Shermans had dry ammo storage, while 76mm Shermans were produced with wet ammo storage. The W in 76W was indicative of that tank having wet ammo storage. Just little fun fact. To save time and your brains, I'm not going to explain the differences between them in depth in this video, but basically, dry ammo storage was more likely to explode when hit, obviously. Because of this, Shermans with 75mm cannons usually had extra plates welded to their sides to cover their ammo racks. Shermans with wet ammo storage didn't. However, tanks that were originally built with dry ammo storage that were then later upgraded obviously wouldn't have their extra plates removed. Therefore, it is not a guaranteed way to identify a Sherman. Rule number 5. Sand skirts were not popular with the Americans and were usually removed. Therefore, it is not a good way to identify a Sherman. Rule number 6. Shermans had two main suspension types, VVSS and HVSS. HVSS was a late war upgrade that significantly improved the handling and ride of the Sherman. HVSS suspension is pretty easy to spot, however, it's not a guaranteed way to identify a Sherman, since it was an upgrade that was eventually given to every model. Rule number 7. The main reason a Sherman received a new designation was due to having a different engine, not the gun, or even the suspension or the armor, except for the M4A1 and the Jumbo, but we'll get to those in a second. So no matter how similar two Shermans can look on the outside, the engine will be the 100% guaranteed factor to identify the variant. And finally, rule number 8. Unlike most other tanks made in other countries, the Sherman was produced by 10 different manufacturers owned by many different companies, such as Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. As such, each factory had its own way of making Shermans, and for as much as the Shermans standardize in parts as much as possible, you can still find extremely minute differences in almost every Sherman variant. This is the reason this video was such a pain to research, because as someone with the idea of a Sherman lineage, all being produced by one company, one right after the other, I couldn't wrap my head around the difference between an M4, an M4A2, and an M4A3. If the M4A1 with its fully cast hull is supposed to be an upgrade of the M4, then why did they switch back to welded armor for the M4A2? For a really long time, I was genuinely confused if the M4 was a separate model of Sherman or just an overarching term for all the Shermans. Among many other things that made no sense to me at the time, I came to realize all I needed was a change in perspective. As I was doing my research, I came across this quote from Wikipedia, which explains this whole thing a lot better than I ever could. The Army had 7 main sub-designations for M4 variants during production. These designations did not necessarily indicate linear improvement. These subtypes indicated standardized production variations, which were in fact often manufactured concurrently at different locations. These subtypes differed mainly in engines, although the M4A1 differed from the other variants with its fully cast upper hull with a distinctive rounded appearance. But with that cleared up, your image of the evolution of American tanks shouldn't look like this, but should instead be more like this. So now that you know what we're doing, and what rules you'll need to follow as we go along, take my hand as we go for an educational walk through this dysfunctional family. And trust me, dysfunctional is not an exaggeration. As we go through these, keep in mind that I'll be moving in chronological order of production, not by model number, so don't be confused if we jump around a little bit. I won't be covering every single version of each of these variants, but I will do my best to cover upgrades that could classify a Sherman as a different model, such as Easy 8s, the Jumbo, the 105mm Howitzer Shermans, the Firefly, and the Composite M4. But trust me when I say there are other, even more minute versions of these tanks that I won't cover in this video because I honestly can't be bothered. Starting off with the M4A5. This design is actually of Canadian origin. Nicknamed the Ram tank, it was built on the same chassis as the Sherman and designated M4A5 by the US military, but it never saw service and was only used for training since it had all the same mechanics as the Sherman. A prototype using the 2-pounder cannon was produced in 1941, with a 6-pounder final version produced from February of 1942 to July of 1943, with 2,032 Ram Mark IIs being produced. Its identifiable features include the riveted front to the turret, the large side hatches, the independently rotating bow machine gun, and the fact that it looks nothing like a Sherman. I could get flack for even including this tank since it's really not a Sherman, but it was given the designation of M4A5 by the US military, and thus I felt like I needed to cover it. Also because nobody really knows a lot about this tank, and I wanted to give it some spotlight. It is still related to the Sherman, however, since it was built on the M3 chassis, which is the same chassis that the Sherman was built on. As we can see from the transmission case and the suspension, they are nearly identical to its Sherman counterparts. As for this tank's role in the family, since it was prototyped in 1941 and produced in February of 1942, it technically makes it the oldest model on this list. Also, since it's a Canadian design, which is technically foreign, I decided to give it the role of the foreign grandpa who barely speaks English and is blatantly racist towards an ethnicity traditionally hated in his home country. By the way, this isn't a dig towards any Canadians. I have no problem with Canadians, I just thought this was funny. Next up we have the M4A1. Produced from February of 1942 to July of 1945, with 9,527 units produced. It's probably the easiest Sherman to identify with its fully cast hull and generally curvy look. I always think this tank looks like something out of Fallout 4. Although I guess, more accurately, the tanks in Fallout 4 look a lot like this, since surely they would be based on the Sherman, not the other way around. Either way, the curvy hull of this design really makes me think of 1950s, 1940s, kind of that curvy space-age car looking things. I don't know, I'll throw up pictures and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. It was the first variant of the Sherman to be produced and the last to have production ceased, making it the longest produced variant of the Sherman. It used the Continental R975C1 or C4 9-cylinder radial gasoline engine, the same engine used in the Sherman's predecessor, the M3 Lee, so it was tried and tested to be a reliable engine. Also because America couldn't make a new engine in time. The M4A1 was widely recognized as the most advanced tank in the world at the time of its debut, however it was quickly outmatched. Its curvy hull gives it a more feminine appearance in my opinion, that plus the fact that it's the first real member of the Sherman family, I've given it the title of the Single Mother. Next up is the M4A2. Produced in 6 different factories with 10,968 of all turret types produced from April of 1942 to July of 1945, making it the second variant of the Sherman to enter production. The M4A2 used the General Motors 6046 twin diesel engine, which was very unique, and the M4A2 remained the only main production variant of the Sherman to have a diesel engine. This is very important. Remember, M4A2 equals diesel engine. It was most popular with the United States Marine Corps. Wikipedia even goes so far as to say it had no use in the Army. At first, I didn't really believe that, since from my perspective the A2 is like the standard Sherman. Or at least, I always felt like it was the most popular variant to see in games and movies. So I would take that with a grain of salt. The Marines liked it so much though, they literally used the M4A2 until they had no other choice but to upgrade to the M4A3, since the A2 ceased production. Even then, they insisted on using M4A3s with 75mm cannons. This was also the only model of Sherman to be lend-leased to the Soviet Union, since the Soviets already used diesel engines in their tanks. Many of them were also sent to the British. If it wasn't a Firefly or an M4A1, it was an M4A2. For some reason, multiple sources have given it the title of the most reliable variant of the Sherman, although I have yet to find any specific explanation as to why. Since it's the second model of Sherman to be produced, I gave it the role of the older brother who had to go through the hardships of being the first child in a family, since he was the first Sherman to have a diesel engine, but still found success in life despite having no clue how he survived his teen years. He's also a star on the swim team due to his popularity with the United States Marine Corps, and he's low-key a socialist because he was the only Sherman to be lend-leased to the Soviets. I recognize I could have also made the M4A2 the father of the family, but trust me, that will come later. Next up is the M4A3. This is where it starts to get a little confusing, so bear with me here. Produced in 3 different factories with all turret types, 12,596 M4A3 Shermans were built in total between July of 1942 and June of 1945, making it the 3rd variant of the Sherman to be produced. The M4A3 used the Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine. It was pretty much exclusively used by the US Army as it was America's favorite Sherman, and didn't get lend-leased to other countries. The A3 was also the main test bed for most of the late war experimental upgrades, such as HVSS, but many of these would also be added to earlier models to allow them to compete. M4A3 75mm tanks with wet ammo storage are extremely rare, since the US Army was hell-bent on tracking them all down and converting them into E876s after the war, in order to standardize to one Sherman type. To quote a source, the Army was so thorough in these conversions, no M4A3 large hatch 75mm gun tanks are known to have survived with the original turrets installed. Any M4A1 HVSS 76 and M4A2 HVSS 76 tanks in Army inventory would have been robbed of their suspensions and turrets so they could be installed on M4A3 large hatch hulls. The M4A3 went on to fight in the Korean War and many others in its final form. Post-World War II, this was the de facto Sherman. Due to its popularity and favoritism within the Army, despite being the 3rd Sherman to enter production, I gave it the title of the middle child who gets all the attention and has had his whole life handed to him on a silver platter. But wait, I know what you're thinking. It looks exactly like the M4A2. And you would be correct. Both of these tanks are built from welded hulls, unlike the M4A1 which was fully cast. However, remember our rules. The main difference of the Sherman is their engines, and we can look to the engine decks of these tanks to find their differences. Even looking at it now, the biggest and honestly only difference between these 2 engine decks is the size of the grates on the rear, with the M4A2 leaving extra room for regular panels to be on either side of the doors, where the M4A3's doors are larger. Next up we have the M4... wait a minute. Hold on. Sorry, this must be a picture of an M4A2 or an M4A3, right? Hold on, let me consult my notes real quick. Let's see. So we say the M4A5, move on to the A1, the Kirby hull is M4A2, is next up. It's M4A3, is M4, but it looks exactly the same. It looks exactly the same. What do my notes say? Oh.
Let's see, diesel engines, the Marine Corps, let's the Soviets know it wasn't that. 3-piece transmissions, no, it doesn't have that. Wet ammo storage, kill resources, exercise items, track extensions.
You don't look so good, buddy. Are you okay?
I'll be okay. I just need a glass of water.
Made in 5 factories from July of 1942 to March of 1945, with 7,584 units produced, it honestly looks exactly like the M4A2 or the M4A3, so I give up on life. For some reason, it's also the 4th variant of the Sherman to be produced, even though it's the 1st in name, and to put the icing on the cake, it shares the Continental C1 or C4 9-cylinder gas radial engine with the M4A1. Mechanically speaking, the 2 are identical. This is also the reason the Sherman and the M3 Lee were so tall, because they were literally using airplane engines. Since it was so tall, the drivetrain had to come through the tank at a weird angle to connect to the transmission. Getting serious though, in terms of identifiable features, the M4 Sherman has the easily recognizable U-shaped rear hull. This is a trait it shares with the M4A1, since they have the same engine. Also, the engine deck has this little boxy rectangle thing on the back with this little guard on it. I don't really know what to call it, but it's a very, very identifiable feature. As far as the Army was concerned, the M4 and the M4A1 were interchangeable since mechanically they were exactly the same, and both were considered the main model of Sherman for Army use until the M4A3 came along. A source tells me they never saw production with the T-23 turret and 76mm guns, which was another surprising discovery for me, and once again, at first I didn't believe it, but once I thought about it for a couple minutes, I realized I've never seen an M476. It's always an A1, an A2, or an A3, but I'll admit I didn't look all that far into it, so if anyone out there can prove me wrong, I'd love to hear what you can find in the comments below. The M4 also began production with the one-piece transmission case, since it was one of the later models of Sherman to be produced, and never had the three-piece transmission. As such, this is one of the few times you can ignore Rule 3. If it has a three-piece transmission case, it is definitely not a standard M4. In an original draft of the script, this was the father of the family, due to it being exactly the same as the M4A1 in every way except visually. Also, just having the M4 and the M4A1 as the parents made the most sense to me. However, since it's the fourth Sherman variant to enter production, I didn't quite think it made sense to be the father, but I still wanted its relationship with the M4A1 to be taken into account. So, I'm giving the M4 the role of the weird uncle who hangs out with his sister and her kids a little too much. Next up, we have the M4A4. Oh boy, this is a personal fave.
This one's a personal fave, dude. This one's a fave.
The M4A4 was produced in one factory by Chrysler from July of 1942 to November of 1943, with 7,499 built. It was the fifth variant of the Sherman to enter production and the first variant of the Sherman to have production fully ceased. In terms of identifiable factors, the M4A4 has a whole bunch. Firstly, and probably the most obvious, is its extended chassis, due to it having a larger engine than any other variant. The chassis literally had to be elongated. As a result of this, the M4A4 has larger gaps between the road wheels and the suspension. It also has the double-door hatch on the back of the engine deck, just like the M4 and the M4A1, however, it doesn't have the identifiable U-shaped rear plate. The M4A4 also has this little hump on its engine deck, which can once again be used pretty easily to identify it as an A4. Due to its sudden cease of production, no M4A4s ever received one-piece transmission cases. This is the second instance in where you can ignore Rule 3. If it has a one-piece transmission case, it is definitely not an M4A4. The A4 also never saw HVSS due to production being halted before it was introduced. Also, the A4 was never produced with the upgraded T-23 turret and the 76mm gun. The M4A4 made use of the Chrysler multi-bank gasoline engine. Now, you have to remember, Chrysler was an automobile manufacturer, not a tank manufacturer. And you have all these variants of the Shermans being produced with gasoline radial engines, which are literal airplane engines, and Ford coming out with their GAA V8 whatever the fuck. So Chrysler felt they had to compete, but they didn't know how to make an engine specifically designed for a tank. So their solution? The Chrysler Multibank. This engine is literally 5 car engines put together on one crankcase, all hooked up to one transmission. Each engine acted independently of one another. It was legit just 5 separate engine blocks stuck together. Each engine either had its own radiator or one huge radiator that covered all the engines, depending on the variant. The Chrysler Multibank was a 30-cylinder engine with 370 horsepower, and it produced slightly over 1,000 pound-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM. And to put a cherry on top, the Chrysler Multibank engine weighed over 2 tons just on its own. Now, you might be seeing this thing and think,
Fucking thing sucks!
But the Chrysler Multibank engine was actually extremely reliable and rarely broke down. However, of course, it was also insanely complicated, and when it did break down, it was a nightmare to repair. However, the British still found a liking for it, as they said its reliability was better than anything they had at the time. For this reason, the M4A4 became very popular with the British in particular. While the British took a pretty good liking to the Chrysler Multibank, the Americans really didn't, and the M4A4 was pretty much never used by the US. A4s were most famously converted to Fireflies, and saw great service life under the British and many other armies despite being disowned by the United States. These nations include Britain, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Czechoslovakia, India, and China, just to name a few. When deciding this tank's role in the family, I had a lot to consider. The tank was abandoned by its original creators, got some plastic surgery to look more feminine in the form of the M4A6, and implants to compete with the other tanks in the form of the Firefly, and it saw extensive use as it was passed around the family before quickly being tossed aside for designs that actually had a personality, making the M4A4 the stepsister. Next, we have the M4A6/M4 Composite Sherman. Both of these tanks have the same quirk, in that their original welded front plates were removed in favor of adding the cast front hull from the M4A1 with its more curvy appearance. This makes the M4 Composite and the M4A6 easy to mistake for the M4A1 at first glance. But there are a few differences. Most notable is the scar you can see on all these tanks that show how they chopped off the front end. These tanks always reminded me of Captain Rex's clone hybrid helmet. In regards to the M4 Composite, Chrysler produced 1,676 M4 composites from August of 1943 through January of 1944. Built on the hull of a standard M4, the British liked it because its turret came with a loader's hatch and converted many into Fireflies. The M4 Composite Firefly is my personal all-time favorite tank, especially the Polish Zemsta 2. I don't know what it is, but something about this tank just looks so cool to me. Other than its cast front hull, it was exactly the same as a standard M4, essentially making it a mix of the M4 and the M4A1, with its mechanics being the same and its hull being a combination of the two. As for the M4A6, it was the last variant of the Sherman to be produced and had by far the shortest production run, with only 75 being made between October of 1943 and February of 1944, and none seeing combat. Unlike the M4 Composite, the M4A6 was built on the hull of the M4A4, so it shares the extended chassis and other identifiable features. The M4A6 actually had a different engine than the tank it was based on, and used the multi-fuel Caterpillar D200A radial engine, with the idea being to use diesel fuel. The M4A6 never would get its moment in the spotlight, however, as towards the end of the war the Army started leaning in favor more towards gas-powered tanks, and thus production of the M4A6 was halted in favor of the M4A3. I'm not entirely sure why this was done, since the M4A6's engine was supposedly multi-fuel and thus could have taken gasoline. Make note, the M4 Composite was simply a modification of the M4, and wasn't officially recognized by the Army as a separate model of Sherman. In official documentation, it was still just an M4 medium, and the Army actually got them confused for M4A1s quite often. The M4A6, on the other hand, was built on the chassis of the A4, but had its own engine, therefore earning it a separate designation by the Army, even though only 75 were made. Since both of these tanks have the rounded front hulls, I figure they'll both be females in our family tree, and since they both have the same quirk and are both easily the most forgotten variants of the Sherman, they've earned the roles of the little sisters who everyone forgot existed. The Firefly. The Fireflies are a British conversion of American Shermans to mount the powerful British 17-pounder gun in order to take on heavier German tanks like the Tiger and the Panther. The British loved this conversion and did it a lot, making the Firefly one of the most famous variants of the Sherman, even though the thing was a nightmare to fight in since the turret was way too small to fit the 17-pounder inside. But we'll get to that in a second. 95% of Fireflies are built from M4A4s. The other 5% are either M4s or composite M4s. The only real identifier you need is the cannon. The 17-pounder with its obviously British muzzle brake can be seen from a mile away. This isn't even an expression. Many Firefly crews added additional camo to the front half of their barrels to hide the fact they were Fireflies. If you want more identifiers though, the M4A4's extended chassis is a dead giveaway, as well as the radio box welded to the rear of the turret. The bow machine gun was also removed to accommodate for more ammo. I'm sure plenty of you have seen the meme potential history made regarding the development of the Firefly. And for as much as I love PH, his meme subscribes to two myths of the Firefly that aren't actually true. Here's the meme for context.
17-pounder won't fit. Put it in sideways. Radio won't fit. Put a hole in the back and have it stick out the back. The engine's no good. Get 5 car engines and put them together.
People think that the British were the ones who strapped 5 car engines together to improve the performance of the tank. However, as we've learned, Chrysler produced M4A4s with these engines, therefore it wasn't a stroke of British engineering. There's also the myth that the gun had to be mounted sideways in order to fit in the smaller Sherman turret. While this isn't entirely false, most people think the gun is at a complete 90-degree angle. However, its tilt isn't nearly that extreme. Sure, it couldn't be installed exactly straight, but it definitely wasn't just put in sideways. As far as I've been able to tell, no M4A2s or M4A1s were converted to Fireflies, and trust me, I looked. I'm not entirely sure why the A4 was specifically chosen to be made into Fireflies, perhaps simply because it was the model the British had the most of. However, considering how determined the British were to convert almost all their M4s and M4A4s into Fireflies, I'm genuinely surprised I haven't been able to find any British-owned A1s or A2s that received the conversion. If anyone out there can find any legitimate images or documentation of British M4A1s or M4A2s that were converted into Fireflies, let me know in the comments below. Also, if anyone is interested in learning more about the British's use of the Sherman in general, check out the link in the comments below. It's actually some pretty cool stuff. Due to the fact that the Firefly is already based on the stepsister of the family, with even more modifications made to it, and the notion that it wasn't used by the US at all, and therefore is kind of an alienated member of the family, will make the Firefly the disfigured product of incest cast out by the family. The Jumbo. The Jumbo was only produced from May of 1944 to July of 1944, with 254 being made, despite being well liked by the troops and requested in high demand. The concept of a heavier assault variant of the Sherman was originally pitched by the British, because we all know how much they love their heavy bunker buster tanks. First tests began with the M4A3 in 1943 at General Motors Proving Ground. It was determined no abnormal failures were encountered. It, therefore, appears feasible to convert a medium tank to an assault tank with a weight of 82,600 pounds, if only limited operation is to be encountered. I've said in a previous video that the Jumbo encountered weight issues during development, and despite what that quote makes it seem, this is still very true. Yes, the concept was deemed feasible, if only limited operation is to be encountered. The Jumbo would only work for as long as it was needed, and even then, the Army knew it wouldn't be practical in the long run. Even though no abnormal failures were encountered, they still had to alter the gear ratios of the tank to deal with the extra weight. The main reason I bring any of this up is because I've seen a lot of people ask why the Jumbo didn't replace the regular Sherman, and the simple answer is, the Jumbo would have run into the exact same problems the Germans had with the Tiger. Sure, it's great for what it was designed to do, but it was only designed to do one thing. After that thing has been done, it needs to be put aside and given a proper maintenance once over before it can head back out again. The United States simply didn't want to have to deal with the additional logistics the Jumbo would have warranted. Despite how it may look, the Jumbo turret was not the T-23 turret. The two have slight variations, with the most notable being the clear difference in the thickness of the armor. The Jumbo's most identifiable traits are the mantlet and the clearly thicker frontal armor. Obviously, this is the heaviest variant of the Sherman, weighing in at 38 tons. It's also important to note that Jumbos were only built on M4A3 Shermans. Since the Jumbo is one of the last versions of the Shermans to be produced, and it looks like a little fat kid, I've deemed it the baby brother who got tired of being bullied at school and took self-defense lessons from his two older brothers. And finally, the M4 105mm Howitzer Sherman. Produced from February of 1944 to mid-1945, 105mm Howitzer Shermans were built on the M4 and M4A3 hull, with one prototype being built on a composite hull. The 105 Sherman can easily be identified by its mantlet and also generally larger diameter of the barrel, and later tanks were even produced with HVSS suspension. After the war, the M4A3 105 was a popular model for experimentation with new concepts and designs. Since regular M4A3s were being upgraded and used as the Army's new standard tank, the A3 105s were seen as a viable substitute, and you can find a whole bunch of post-war experimental variants of the Sherman that were built from old A3 105s. Since there was a prototype built on the M4 composite, and it's got a thick boy gun, the 105mm Sherman is the fat lesbian of the family. Don't ask me why, I just thought that made sense. Whew! That was a lot. I hope you've all learned something, and more importantly, I hope I've been able to show some of you why I like the Sherman so much. Oddly enough, the time I've spent doing all the research for this video was some of the most fun I've ever had researching tanks, even though it was by far the most time I've ever dedicated to researching one specific tank. This whole video was sparked by my discovery of the M4A6 last summer. I spent a few hours reading about it, then discovered the composite M4 and subsequently the composite Firefly, which became my favorite tank of all time not long after. Then, more recently, I made my discovery about the Sherman lineage, and when I realized I knew nothing about my favorite tank, I was filled with the drive to understand everything about it. I had created this channel about a month before all this, and I was actively deciding what my next video should be about, and I was really close to making it about the history of the Christie suspension and its use in the BT and T-34 series of tanks, since the release of my War Thunder montage for the BT. But I decided to make this video instead, since I had already been doing the research on the subject. If that Christie suspension video sounds interesting to any of you, let me know in the comments. I've got a huge list of video ideas, so I definitely won't run out anytime soon, but feedback is always appreciated. As I said in the opening, I didn't cover every version of the Sherman that exists. that video would be hours long, just based on the versions that I could find. But the Sherman's legend goes even further than World War II, and some of my other personal favorite Shermans are post-war variants. Seeing old Shermans given new life and fighting in modern conflicts is one of the coolest things for me, and I would love to make a video on all the different post-war versions of the Sherman used by other countries around the world. But even if I don't, if this video was remotely interesting to any of you, I strongly suggest doing some digging of your own on the subject. It's some truly awesome and fascinating stuff. But with all that wrapping up, I've been talking for way too long, and honestly this video is getting a lot longer than I originally thought it would be. And I've had to cut out a lot of stuff, including an entire segment talking about the 76mm variant of the Sherman and explaining exactly what makes a Sherman an Easy 8. But I figure I'll probably just turn those into their own videos. As always, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to my channel if you guys enjoyed what you see. Leaving a like actually is one of the best things that you guys can actually do because it tells the YouTube algorithm that you enjoyed my content and it'll push it out for others to see. Spreading my content by word of mouth is also awesome if you guys can tell your friends about me if this is something that you guys enjoyed. So just to wrap everything up, thank you guys so much for watching and I really hope you guys learned a lot. And I will see you all in the next video.